Okay, so as usual with one of my builds, we're not going to start with the rotor head because I don't want the rotor head lying around where it can get trodden or broken whilst I'm building up the frames. So we start out with the frames, which is a much more robust item, build that first and then build the rotor head afterwards. First step of the frame build is to install these little metal parts onto the bottom plate of our frames, and we use these button head screws in order to do that. Okay, and there we have those mounted with the little tabs to the outside, and those are going to go into the outer sides of the main frames. They'll come down around these tabs effectively. Okay, so the next thing to move on to is building up one side of our side frames. Okay, the next part of our build is building up one side of the main frames, as I mentioned. In order to do that, there are some bits that we need. We need the bottom plate that I just built, but we also need the front radio tray you have here, and we also need this rear part of the frames, which goes up the back here, sits up in this recess at the back here like that, in there. Additional to that, we also need the motor mount, the pinion support mount, and we also need our bearing blocks, and there is also a cross strut as well, which makes up part of this build up of the main frames. Okay, so those are all the parts. I'm going to start off by bolting the battery tray into the front of the frames. Okay, when you mount up the battery tray at the front, the bottom mount point just uses a collared screw, but the top one is part of our Canopy mounting system. I've got the bits for it here, let's move this out of the way. You've got this kind of rubberized piece and then a metal bit as well, and a screw, and basically the screw goes through the metal piece and then that inserts down into that rubberized piece, and then you can push it into place like so, and you see your screw poking out the other end, and then that can be screwed into the frames to hold the upper point on the battery tray. Okay, and when done it should look like that. So that's the battery tray done. I'm now going to mount the bearing blocks into the frames, and we don't use any Loctite on these at this point. They're just done up finger tight just to hold the bearing blocks into the frames. Okay, so here we have the bearing blocks, and what I wanted to show you was that these are keyed. They have to go in a particular way. One side of them is closed off like this, and then the other side is open. You can see the bearing. And basically the way these go into the machine is the top bearing block goes in with the bearing, the open-ended part of the bearing facing towards the sky, and the bottom block goes in the other way up like that with the open part of the bearing facing towards the ground. So it's simple as that. So they just go in effectively like that in the machine. Okay, so there we have the bearing blocks mounted in. You can see the open end of the bearing towards the top of the frames, and then the closed off portion on the bottom bearing and the upper bearing, and then the underside, the open part of the bearing. Okay, so next thing we're going to do is put the motor mount into the frames and the pinion support. Okay, so there we have the pinion support mounted in the frames. If you look, you can see where I put that. Also, the open-ended part of the bearing goes towards the sky on this. With regard to the motor mount, I'm actually not going to do that just yet. We need to mount the motor into the motor mount first before it goes into the frames, and it's actually easier to mount that once the two frame halves are together. So I'm going to leave the motor mount for the moment, and I'm going to look at putting the bottom tray onto this frame. Okay, so just before I put the bottom tray on, one of the things we need to do is to put the other metal pieces into our side frame. So this one goes at the front, just sits in there like so, and then this one is the rear, sits in there like so. So just bolt those in, and then we can put the bottom tray on. Okay, so there we see those two items installed. Like so. And now we can bolt our bottom tray into place. Okay, and there's the bottom tray mounted in place and just secured with 2 screws there at the bottom. Okay, next we have a few bits and pieces to install. We've got our front and then our longer rear canopy mounts to install, and to put those in we use these button headed screws. We've got a servo mounting to install into the frames, which we use a little self-tapping button headed screw for, and we've got a cross brace for the frames to install, which we use an ordinary screw, collared screw for. And we're also going to put this carbon piece into the back of the frames, which just slots into a couple of slots in the frames. And once we've done that, we've completed one side frame, and we can prep the other side frame ready to put the 2 frames together. Okay, so if we have a look at this now, we can see our cross support is right in the middle here under the main gear. I've now also mounted up this carbon piece into the slot at the top. Additionally, if we go around to the other side, you can see the front here, this is the front canopy mount, and then right at the top here is the rear canopy mount, and both of these are next to a slot. So you've got a slot here where one canopy mount goes, and then a slot down here where the other canopy mount goes. And that's pretty much it. We're now, oh, the last thing I put in was this little servo mounting bracket, and that's just got a little button head screw through it there to hold it in place and provide mountings for screws for the servo. Okay, so having built up one side frame, we now have to get the other side frame ready, which is pretty much exactly the same as what we've done, except there's less bits to put onto it because most of them are mounted into the other frame. So I'll just mount this up with the bits that need to go onto it, and then we can look at putting the 2 side frames together. Okay, so here's our other side frame prepped, and all we needed to put into this was the 2 canopy posts and also the little servo mounting bracket. And once that's in place, we can bolt this side frame to our other side frame, which I'll now go ahead and do. Okay, something I just forgot to mention on building up this second side frame was to add in the little blocks at the bottom here. And once you've added those in, you can bolt the whole thing together, and it basically will look something like this. Okay, so that's our basic frame set done. We can now move on to putting the undercarriage on this and also bolting the motor into the frames. Okay, so here's the bits we need for our motor mount. We've got our pinion, which has a double grub screw that goes in it, which you can see just here. These are double grub screws. 4 screws for mounting the motor, and washers and the motor mount itself. So we just need to mount the pinion up and then bolt the motor into the mount. Okay, and once you've mounted that up, it should look something like this. The manual does give a measurement for how much of the shaft should be poking out the top here, which is 4.7mm, so you do need to check that. Also make sure that one of the grub screws is biting onto the flat that is on the main shaft. The other grub screw just goes against the main shaft itself. Lots of Loctite on the grub screws, of course, and a little tiny bit of Loctite on the motor mount screws. And that's ready for installing into the frames. Okay, so here we have a set of built skids. Things to point out: the rubbers, mount them on the insides here rather than the outside. That way you'll never lose them. These have a habit of coming off. CA the stoppers in at either end. Use some CA to glue those in. Make sure you get the align writing on the outside of your skid pipes. And also, if you notice, the skids actually slope sort of forwards that way rather than backwards. And that's pretty much all you need to know about the skids. I've put the grub screws in but not tightened them down yet, because we're still going to need to slide these struts backwards and forwards to match up with the mounting points on the underside of the frames. So the next job is to offer this up to the underside of the frames and bolt it in place with the screws and washers up here. Okay, so here we have the underside of the frames. You can see the struts bolted in by the two screws with Loctite, and that's our skids mounted, and I've also done up these grub screws now as well to hold the skid pipes in position and push the rubbers to the outer edges. So we're now in a position to mount our motor into the frames. Okay, so I've placed the motor kind of into the frames around about where it's going to need to go, which is in the top of the frames here, as you can see, and the motor kind of sits there like so, and I've angled these wires to the front because the speed controller may well sit up the front here somewhere. I haven't decided exactly where to put that yet. Basically we screw the motor mount in place at the sides here, and that will hold it in place. And then once we've got that in place, we're then at a point where we're starting to mount servos into the machine. Okay, so that's our motor mounted into the machine, and what I want to point out here is we use these button headed screws to mount the motor, and also if you look here, the top of the motor shaft is going into our pinion support block, so the pinion is effectively braced at the top, and that's why that 4.7mm was sticking out the top of the pinion. It was to insert into the bearing in the pinion support block. So that's our motor securely in place, and there's no adjustment of the motor, it's fixed in that position, so your mesh is automatically set.